You know those moments when you're super motivated to scroll through social media, but you just can't find it in you to go hit the gym or to start the project that you know you need to get working on? Or even when you're excited to start a new Netflix series, but you can't even get yourself to do that. Well, there's actually some pretty interesting brain science behind it all. You're not crazy. A lot of things helped our ancestors survive in prehistoric times. So much so that our brains and our literal hardwiring adapted to keep what works and what doesn't. And I've talked about this in the past, especially with like our limbic brain and how that controls our fear and like fight or flight instincts, which again, yes, would be super helpful if we're being chased by a tiger to have those things like come up. But sometimes the brain and the fight or flight instinct turns on when we're trying to just make like a work phone call. We hop into that mode. And another thing, like jealousy and people pleasing, and even our underlying need to like fit in everywhere we go, stems from living in tribal communities where if we didn't fit in with the group back then or we weren't well liked, we risked being literally cast out and having no access to food and actually starving to death. So just like all these other systems that came into place to protect us back then, our entire motivation system was designed for a completely different world than the one that we live in today. So our brains evolved to help us survive in a tribal landscape where the resources were super scarce and almost every decision mattered for survival. But if you look at now, we're living in a world where we have so much abundance and we have instant gratification and we have access to like everything. And honestly, our brains are a bit overwhelmed by it. So in today's episode, we're going to break down the brain science in a fun and accessible way that we're going to explore why our brains feel so motivated to do certain things, but not others. And more importantly, how we can actually work with our brain's natural wiring to basically, flip the switch of motivation in our favor. So whether you want to start working out, you have to start a new project and you don't know how to get yourself the motivation to do it, or you want to break old habits, we can do that. And we're going to learn how to do that. One of the coolest things about understanding how your brain works is that you actually start to notice these patterns in your daily life. And you'll begin to see that many of your behaviors aren't random, that they're your body and your mind trying their best to basically help you survive and thrive, even if they're using basically an outdated operating system, So by the end of this episode, I hope that you have a better understanding of how your brain works and why you do what you do. Plus, I'm going to share some practical and like easy to implement strategies that will help your brain do the work for you instead of against you. So let's dive in. If you're new here, I am your host, Amanda McCormack. I am a yoga teacher, a personal trainer, a nutrition coach, and a women's coaching specialist. And this show basically explores all the ways that we can add more happiness into your life, mind, body, and soul, all holistically. So we talk fitness, nutrition, wellness, health, inspiration, manifestation, all that good stuff. We basically talk about the things that are going to change your life. So you can follow along with the show on Instagram under Happy Holistic Hippie. But let's get into it. We're going to talk about the science behind dopamine and break it down into itty bitty digestible pieces for the first part of the episode. So when you hear the word dopamine, you might be thinking, oh, that's a feel-good hormone. That's what most people think. But actually, dopamine plays a major role in focus, motivation, and just actively pursuing things that make us feel good. So it's not just like a, quote, pleasure chemical, which is often called, but it's actually more about motivation and like anticipation than pleasure itself. So I guess the first thing I want to like lay out in this episode is it's important to understand that we have a baseline of dopamine in our system. And this baseline is responsible for our general mood and our motivation levels. And now there's like no such thing as a specific like dopamine hit. You may see like on Instagram, people are like, oh, this gave me a dopamine hit or a dopamine whatever. But we can experience peaks in dopamine. So sometimes it might be like a dopamine spike. Just know that there's not one specific thing that can give you like a hit of dopamine, but we can kind of use our brain to have a peak in it. There's always going to be a baseline. You're never going to be completely out, and you're never going to add more than you can already like withstand, if that makes sense. It can peak and go up and down, but you're not going to be able to like collect it from the outside world in any way. So the level of dopamine you have is the primary determinant of how motivated you are, how excited you are, how like open and outward facing you are, like how up for things you are. If your friend asks you to go do something, you may be feeling good and be like, yeah, I'll come, but other times you don't. That's also motivated by dopamine. And how willing we are to lean into life and how willing we are to just pursue things. Without dopamine, we're not motivated to seek out the things that we need for our basic survival. So dopamine is needed to do the work to get the actual thing we need or want. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the whole ancestral part of the brain, but I just want to let you know a visual of like where dopamine is produced in the brain. So dopamine is produced in the nucleus accumbens part of the brain. And when we do something, it could be anything, good, bad, whatever, it's relative, dopamine is released. So dopamine is released after we take an action. And we can't control this directly as it's in our wiring, why we like certain things and don't like certain things and why it's triggered. But just know that you have to do something for dopamine to be released. And the thing is, we can't totally change the dopamine pathway. We can't change that. That's just our hard wiring. But the cool thing is we can learn to utilize other parts of our brain to reduce the power that the nucleus accumbens, the part of the brain that has dopamine, has over us, So we can't take away dopamine totally, but we can work on almost regulating it by kind of leaning into other parts of the brain. And that's going to be a big focus in this episode. I'm going to explain a little bit about dopamine so that you can understand it better and get a good picture of how it works and operates in the brain. And then we're going to circle back to this idea that there's other parts of the brain and other things that we can do in activities in everyday life that can almost like fire up those parts of the brain to kind of override the dopamine circuits. So we can kind of almost control it in that way. That's the cool thing about like neuroscience. The way that we release dopamine, again, like I mentioned, comes from evolution. Dopamine is critical for survival. It is a chemical that tells us what we should explore, approach, go after, and it's literally quite known sometimes as a survival chemical. So it exists to motivate our behaviors toward particular goals, whether that's reproducing, to get food, to get water. So, okay, like an example in like ancient times, if we stayed in one spot for too long, we may run out of food sources. So dopamine would motivate us to keep moving or keep looking for food sources so that we wouldn't starve and die. That's how ancestral like dopamine works in the brain. If we were super thirsty, we would be really motivated to seek out water, and then because we basically would get a dopamine hit after we found a source of water and drank it. And then once that dopamine would happen, we'd feel it in our brain. It's almost like behavioral reinforcement. We would be like, okay, well, water is good because when I drink water, my brain gives me this chemical that makes me feel awesome. So it's going to motivate me in the future to keep an eye out for water sources. Or if there's no water right here now, I know I'm going to have to go and like search and travel and look for water sources because when I drink water, I feel good, and so on. So that's why dopamine it's released in like reproduction as well. That's why we have an urge to reproduce and like have sex. It's because it encourages us as a survival instinct. We feel good afterwards, and it reinforces that in our head so that we look for that like next hit in a way. So the message is, again, when we're living in scarcity mode or we want to survive, where there's danger in the world, this is like a really perfect model for the way our brain works, it basically makes sure that we're never satisfied, we're always seeking more. Our brain is built to make us seekers. So we're seekers. We're looking for things all the time and we're never satisfied. And maybe you can see where I'm gonna go with this, but it works in the old model. But you got to think about today, it's a little different. So we're not evolved for like the easy hits of dopamine that we can get in this modern world, such as social media, which is a big one. I'm going to talk a lot about social media. And then things like alcohol, drugs, even like video games, things that just like light up the dopamine pathways in our brain. Like we used to have to do a lot of work to get the dopamine, we'd have to like hunt and find a mate in a sense, or go find food and water, and then we'd get the dopamine. But now we don't have to. We were evolved to do a lot of work up front for a reward. So things like the internet are quote unquote synthetic dopamine, alcohol, drugs, nicotine. Those are like the classic examples. But even things like sometimes we'll condition ourselves to take tons of naps or do other things. Some people get like almost addicted to like reading. Now, I don't want to say that as like one of the main things in the episode, but it could happen in like different ways. But these are synthetic dopamine sources that just give us so much dopamine, and we're wired for scarcity, but we live in a time of abundance. So that's what the whole issue is, and that's why people are finding themselves unmotivated in things. It's just we're basically super overwhelmed. Our reward system is just overwhelmed, And there is a relationship between the amount of dopamine released in the brain and the desire to exert effort, because sometimes if we're getting a lot of dopamine, we don't want to exert effort because we feel like we don't need to. It's easy to get. And oh my gosh, the only thing I hated about doing a lot of research for this episode is every single experiment or like research is done on rats, and these poor rats, man, they literally either like starve the rats, or they would like modify their brains, or I tell you, man, almost every study they're shooting these rats up with cocaine because cocaine is like something that gives off a lot of dopamine, so they would like put it in certain control groups. And I'm just like, these poor rats. So I do have an example, and I probably have like 2 or 3 different rat examples in this episode, but like, man, I feel for these rats. I just wanted to put a little disclaimer, like, pour one out for the rats. But to show that dopamine is important and we can't take away dopamine, we kind of have to work around it. Like, rats were split into 2 different groups, like a control group that was normally fed and they lived and they didn't do anything wrong with them. They just put them in a box. And then they had this other section of rats that they went in and they removed the parts of the brain that produced dopamine. So these rats could not physically produce dopamine, and this is group B. So when group A would eat, they'd give them food and group A would eat. And then they put food out in front of group B and they would not eat. They would try to force feed the rats, so they would like literally hold the piece of food up to the rat's mouth that had the dopamine removed, and the rat would eat it if you put it like literally on their lips. But if you took that same piece of food and put it like 2 inches away from the rat, it literally, no matter how hungry the rat was, it would not eat it, and like they would just starve and die. Even though it was 2 inches away from their face, these rats had no desire, they had no motivation, they had no instinct to like go and get it, so they wouldn't. But if you put the food on their lips, they would eat it. So that's what happens when you're completely depleted of dopamine, which again we don't want. But now we're going to talk a little bit about how dopamine is released in the brain. So this should only be like a little cute 2-3 minute section here where I'm just going to explain a bit about the brain before we get into some actionable steps. It's not going to be 2 minutes. It's going to be a little longer, but I broke it down in a really fun way. So if you couldn't tell, I nerd out about this topic. I did a whole project in college that I won on a business award that had to do a bit with dopamine and brain receptors, but it had to do with Parkinson's. We can talk about that another time. Parkinson's is kind of related to dopamine because they have a low level of dopamine and their body's like not motivated to move because dopamine can affect movement at like those critical health levels. But circling back to the episode. So basically, our brain is just a bunch of wires, okay? They conduct like electric signals, and these long wiry cells are called neurons, and that's what neuroscience is. It's basically the science of these cells in the brain. So super long cells called neurons, and they're all hanging out in the brain, and they communicate with each other, but they don't actually touch. So it's like a long string, and then there's a gap. They don't touch, there's a little gap, and then the next neuron exists, and then there's a gap and another neuron. The gaps are called synapses, okay? And instead, because they don't actually touch, there's like these little bridges that the brain builds so that you can get over to one neuron to the next and send a message to them. And the gap is called, well, it's technically like neurotransmitters. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter. Dopamine is actually a neuromodulator, which I'll talk about right now. It's a neuromodulator, so it's just like a level up from a neurotransmitter. It just means it's super powerful. So a neurotransmitter, again, is the little bridge between the neurons that neuron number 1 can send an electric signal down its tail, and it'll cross the bridge, and then it'll go and talk to the second neuron that it wants to talk to. So that's what a neurotransmitter is. It's the little bridge in between the neurons. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter and a neuromodulator, and a modulator is just basically a level up. It means that it can not only talk to one neuron, but it can talk to so many neurons at once. So usually the brain will like send out a flood of dopamine, and it's able to talk to a whole bunch of neurons instead of just talking to the guy next to it, okay? It's almost like a conductor leading an entire orchestra, or like an instructor leading a workout class. It can tell everybody what to do. That's how powerful dopamine is, and that's why I kind of wanted to break it down. So that is how we release dopamine. The next thing to know about the brain is that our body basically always likes to be in balance. Who doesn't, It doesn't want too much of one thing, and when it has too much of one thing, it'll find a way to even out the balance. And this is true on so many levels. This is also true in like exercise science, where if you're overworking your right leg or you hurt your right leg, your body is going to try and compensate by, you won't notice it, but it's going to be using your left leg a lot more, and then sometimes now your left leg can be prone to injury. The body just always wants to return to a balanced state. That's the other thing you need to know. So this is called homeostasis. Sometimes it's called neuroadaptation. Homeostasis you've probably heard of before. But let me give you a good example about this in terms of if we've had too much pleasure or too much of something. And the easiest demonstration is using drugs or alcohol for this example. But again, this can happen on smaller scales. But this might actually explain a little bit about hangovers for you, which is always fun. It's a party trick to tell everybody this. But when you experience dopamine, right? And again, dopamine can happen when you crave something or if you actually get it. Your baseline, because remember we have a baseline of dopamine the entire time, and now we crave something or now we're going to do something that spikes our dopamine. We have a baseline, but we're going to have a spike, right? After we have something that's super pleasurable, your baseline drops. So if you have something that's so pleasurable, like I said, synthetic dopamine, which comes from like drugs and alcohol, and if you're drinking a lot of alcohol, you're going to have a huge spike, right, in your dopamine. You're going to feel great. But because your spike is so high, your body wants to bring you back down to baseline, which is why you're going to drop. So your pleasure is going to be super high, but guess what's coming next? Pain, in a sense, because that's how your body balances it out on a pleasure and a pain scale. So you can think of it as like a literal scale, and if you have way too much on one side of pleasure, your body is going to like send cells and set things up in your body to bring it back to homeostasis on the other side. And the only thing that sucks is once your body kind of brings it back to balance and it adds like a lot of pain on one side, it doesn't just automatically like clear out. It stays and it lingers. So this is called AKA a hangover, or if like drug users, it's like a come down, you know? It's your body having that like moment of craving and balance. So that's literally why we get hangovers. It's the body trying to bring itself back into homeostasis, and the only way it knows how to do it is by adding pain, because you had a ton amount of pleasure, which our human bodies were not made for. We were not made for synthetic things like alcohol and drugs. So that's why we have such an adverse reaction when we have alcohol. And addictions, we're not going to go too much into addictions, but when addictions happen, it's because we're constantly, again, we're seekers. We're looking for more pleasure. So once you get like a hit of something, your body like wants more of a hit the next time, and you'll look out for like a more potent form, or you'll drink more, and that's kind of how addictions happen. But it's just kind of cool to know that we can have empathy for ourselves, because this is literally like hardwired in us. Like when we're tilted into pleasure, we really want to even it out, and our body brings up pain. And then other way around, when we have too much pain, we'll seek out pleasure, which is why when you're not, we'll talk about this later, but when you're not feeling your best, if you're feeling down or you're feeling sick, you're going to look for easy, quick hits of dopamine, which might be scrolling on social media, playing a video game, distracting yourself from stuff, or even things like, again, like nicotine, drugs, and alcohol. So we're just always trying to restore the balance in our bodies, and it's just hardwired inside of us. So again, drug of choice, whether it's food, social media, or sleep, they release a lot of dopamine. So when we're exposed to an extreme stressor, or we had like a hard day at work, we're going to go do the thing that gives us a lot of dopamine, you know? So we're just wired to consume as much as whatever releases dopamine to us in our brains. We're just wired to go after that. That's why different people end up going down different paths in their lives with things they enjoy, because whatever brings you dopamine, you're going to chase after it. Now, scientists know everything I'm going to tell you in a little bit about our tips at the end of this section. Scientists know these things, marketers know these things. Companies pay billions of dollars to have people on their team who can take this type of science and turn it into something that goes into their business model or goes into their algorithm, so that people have this hardwiring in their brains and they almost fall like victim, I'd say, to like getting addicted to these things, because they have scientists that study this and put it into like research. So an example is novelty spikes dopamine. So when we experience something that's similar to us, but it has a little twist of something new, it really excites us. You know, not knowing what's next excites us. And it's just like a human thing that we're kind of drawn to novelty. And algorithms know this. And algorithms know it because, again, people are paid to do this. That's why, for example, you ever go on Instagram and you're scrolling, and one of the recent updates is like you get suggested post. So it's suggested in the term that the algorithm looks at what you like to look at, and it sneaks in something that it's not somebody you follow. You didn't choose to follow them, but their stuff is getting pushed on your page. That's a way of allowing a little bit of novelty onto your feed. So now you're not only getting the same people you see every day, but oh, wait, this is similar. This is kind of something I like, but it's new. And you may follow the page or whatever, but that's like a sneaky way. Another thing you can think of is literally the entire business model of TikTok. You don't know what's next. That's why you're going to keep swiping. You literally do not know what's next. You're going to keep swiping. Again, you kind of know it's going to be your feed is curated to kind of your vibe. Like you might get videos that are in your interest, your niche, but you don't know who's next or what's next. And that's what makes you keep swiping. That's the science between slot machines. People do slot machines and get addicted to gambling because they don't know what they're going to get. And that's what makes it so like you don't know if it's going to be good or bad, but you may get good, so you're going to keep going. And this science is what people pay so much money to have marketing people and designers put into their work. It's actually crazy. Same thing with updates just in general. Like when people update apps, the reason that people update apps or like companies update apps for you is because it's the same app but a little different. You know, when Stories was introduced, you're on the same app, and now there's like a new way to use it in a sense. It's just, you can see this, and we're going to circle back to novelty in a little bit. But yeah, and again, just not feeling that empathy for ourselves because we have access to social media. We have the phone in our hand. We have access 24/7. And again, it's wired to like make you addicted. So have empathy for yourself when we're talking about like social media. Another thing that may be useful to understand how your past plays a role in why we're struggling to do something now is this little section here, and then we're going to get into our tips. So I hope this part just makes things click and can help you realize like, oh my gosh, I'm not crazy. It's just a part of biology. So on the form of addiction, I'm going to use addiction as an example, but we can always, like if you're not addicted to something, just take this example with like a grain of salt because we can work backwards with it and kind of see bits and pieces of this in our lives. So whether you're addicted to like drugs, alcohol, sugar, social media, there's like a latent echo that kind of happens in our brain. So if you ate a lot of sugar as a kid, you know, you grew up and your parents gave you a lot of sugar, and then, you know, you became an adult and you stopped eating that much sugar, but you find yourself sometimes on weekends like having sugar, you may notice it's easier for you to want it all the time once you start it again, because it kind of sets you up like when you're younger. If you have something around the age where your brain is developing, you could be prone to wanting it more. So if as a kid you played like a lot of video games and then you fell into a hole where now you're playing video games as an adult, not that these things are inherently bad, but it just may be easier for you to fall into the trap of that, which is also why I don't know, like sugar, digital media, video games, nicotine, like when you're younger, people who vape, like kids who vape, like they're gonna have more prone situations in the future because their brains are still developing, and it's easier to kind of get the dopamine loop with these items. That's also why, like, you know, iPad kids, like when you give kids iPads and social media, they may have a harder time in the future actually being able to pull away from these things because you're giving it to them as like at such a young age. I literally have another rat example. I'm sorry to bring the rats back into this, but they had a study where they basically gave these rats cocaine for one day, and they kind of went into this like running frenzy. Like they gave the rats cocaine and then they exhibited this weird behavior, right? Then they stopped for a full year. They didn't give the rats any cocaine. And then 1 year later, they gave the rats cocaine and they had the exact same reaction as they did the first time. So it just shows that like you may be able to return back to old responses very easily if you're exposed to something that you got dopamine at a younger age. You can kind of kick back into that instinct, which on an addiction scale, that makes sense as well when people like relapse, because it's like it doesn't really matter the amount of time, like just a little taste of something might bring back up like a neurological echo that you had in the past. Now this is the interesting part. At age 5, we have more neurons and neurological connections in our brain than we do the rest of our lives. That's kind of why we're good learners at that age, why kids can learn instruments and languages really easily when they're younger. It's because they have so many more neurons and neural connections. So as we age, our brain basically develops at 25, around that age, okay? And as we're aging, up from literally 5 to 25, we kind of prune in our brain. We do a little maintenance. Neurological like connections that we're not using or we don't use a lot, we kind of prune and get rid of them, you know, as a form of adaptation. So as your frontal lobe develops, we start to just use the neural connections that we use most often, so the most dominant things that we do. So if you work in like engineering, your brain is going to kind of start to gear and use those engineering parts of your brain more. If you don't, let's say you used to do art, but you don't do art that much anymore, those parts of your brain they're not going to like fade away, you're going to lose them, but they're just not going to be as strong and prominent as the part of your brain that you do every day. Like if you're a handyman and you're using your hands every day at work, that part of your brain is going to be like a little bit more on fire as you age up till 25. So we do prune the connections that we don't use often, which is why sometimes it feels like we forget things. But it's almost like neurological scaffolding, you know? It's not to scare you, but it's, again, just like an educational thing. So from like 5 to 25, within those developmental years, if we were drinking a lot or if we were vaping a lot, your body will kind of hang on to that and have a tendency to want to do that for the rest of your life. And it could be cool for the good things in your life. Like if you're chronically studying and actively like trying to learn new instruments or whatever, like that, you're going to have an easier tendency in like 20 years. But like after 25, we can do things, and there's no like infinite, you know, like we can totally learn and grow and everything, but sometimes it's easier to learn and grow from the things that we were actively pursuing from ages 5 to 25. In a negative way, like I was saying, if you're vaping a lot, like I'm using the vape example here, but if you vape a lot from like, hopefully not from age 5, but from any point of like 5 to 25, it's going to be harder for you to kick that, or you may have more urges in the future when you're 40 to do that. So you may be inclined to some behaviors, right? But again, it does not mean by any means that like all hope is lost. By working with the other systems in the brain, which I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we can almost override the control that the dopamine system has in our head. So this is the fun part of the episode. We are going to go into 8 different tips to help you out in this section and talk about the different parts of the brain that we can use to just change our life. So now that I gave you the low of dopamine and how it works and some things that we're prone to, let's switch it up a little bit. So remember, again, in today's world, we basically face this really weird, unique challenge, I'd say, that we evolved for an environment of scarcity, but now we live in an environment of abundance, and our brains weren't designed for the constant easy access to dopamine hits that our modern life basically provides us, whether again it's through social media, processed foods, or other instant gratification. So this is kind of like a dopamine dilemma, maybe I'd like to call it, where we constantly get easy rewards, we reset our baseline, and then it makes it harder for us to feel motivated for activities that require more effort, but you do know deep inside are like more beneficial for you in the long run. So the goal of this section is using the other parts of the brain to override the brain. So my first tip, I dubbed it morning dopamine management. So dopamine, if you want to think of it, it's like a bank, okay? You have a bank of dopamine every day. It kind of resets when you sleep. You always have it, but it's at a higher level in the morning. And just like a real bank, when you have a lot of money, you're able to spend more of it, right? And when you don't have a lot of money, it's not the best to spend more than you have, right? So there are things called highly dopamigenic activities, which we've talked about, especially in the last section, a lot. Those are things that are going to give you quick hits of dopamine. It could be drugs, it could be alcohol, it could be social media, it could be processed foods, things like that. So these are things where the less dopamine you have, it's easier to engage in the activity. The lower your energy level it is, basically, the easier it is to engage in dopamigenic activities, because they will squeeze that last bit of dopamine out of your brain and make you feel good. So when you're down and low or tired per se, or you don't have a lot of dopamine left, you're going to reach for something that's going to give you a quick hit of dopamine, like a high hit of it, and it's going to make you feel good. So scrolling on your phone, video games. I've talked about in episodes before how the morning, like your morning makes your day. And I've talked about how it's really good to kind of ease into your day, whether it's through meditation or taking your time. And you always hear people, especially like in the health and wellness field, saying, don't go on your phone like immediately in the morning. And hopefully what I'm going to tell you right now, kind of solidifies that and explains it in a different way. I've talked about the brain, how it moves from like delta to theta waves, and you want to have like a gradual increase. So you don't really want to go on your phone right away, because like it brings you from like 0 to 100, and that is true. But this is another thing that happens in your brain when you go on your phone in the morning or you do a high dopamigenic activity. And again, I mean scrolling on your phone. I mean turning on your phone and going on Instagram, turning on your phone and just going on TikTok immediately, okay? The minute that you engage in a high dopamigenic activity in the morning, it drains a large amount of your dopamine reserve for your day. Like most of it, honestly. And when that happens, you won't have a lot of dopamine reserve left for your entire day. Again, you always have dopamine, but it just is going to drop dramatically, you know? And now that means that you're going to have low levels or like almost nothing left for when you need sustained effort for the things you actually want to do. So let's say like work out after work. You wake up in the morning, the first thing you do is you go on TikTok, you scroll. Then you go to work, which may be like draining, and you may have to go through different things in your day that might deplete your dopamine stores just a little bit. And then you get home at 4 p.m. The last thing you want to do is get up and go to the gym. The easiest thing for you to do is get back on your phone. So again, I've mentioned we don't want to get rid of dopamine completely. We don't want to detox ourselves of dopamine, right? We just want to make sure that we have a high level of dopamine available during our day so that when we do things that require sustained effort, maybe give you a little reward, like not a huge reward, we still have dopamine to get things done and we still have a strong dopamine response, you know? That's why it's important to do productive things in the morning, you know? Even when it comes to doing something that's just good for you in terms of like a meditation, reading a book, doing something that's productive, it's easier to get done in the morning. Like people who do work out in the morning, they do have it right in a sense. Even if it's just getting up and doing like a 5-minute stretch on the side of your bed, just doing something where you're getting like a dopamine hit in a healthy way. You're training your brain for the day to be like, okay, I'm going to do something that requires just a little bit of effort and I'm going to get a nice hit of dopamine afterwards, and then it kind of sets your baseline for the day. Your reserves will be full. If you wake up and do something that gives you a huge hit of dopamine immediately in like a artificial way, then your body's just going to be like craving and looking for that type of huge hit all day long. Like you're setting your body up to look for that hit. And then meanwhile, you're also depleting your dopamine store, so you're not going to have a lot left. And it's just a cycle. When you don't have a lot left, you look for the big hits and it kind of goes on all day long. That's why you're more prone to go on your phone if you go on like during your day, if you start your day with going on your phone. So it's important to do things productive in the morning or set a rule for yourself. Try not to scroll on your phone for the first hour after waking up. I know it sounds like a lot. You can go on your phone, you can text people. Just try not to like doom scroll. Maybe set a rule the first 10 minutes, then move it to 20 minutes. An hour is ideal, but anything in that field is so good. It'll regulate your body for like the entire day. You know, you'll have more dopamine and you'll be able to get through bigger challenges more easily in your day. Guess who I'm bringing back into this episode? We got the rats. We got another rat example. So this study, they had 2 groups of rats again. They had a normal control group and then they had a separate control group. So in the first control group, they put out stale food for the rat to eat, and then they put a little shelf in the box with real good food up top. So if the rat wanted to have the good food, all they had to do was jump and get up onto that shelf, which wasn't really far. It was like a baby jump and they could eat the food, right? So that was what was happening in control group 1. In the second control group, they set it up the exact same way, but again, they took the dopamine out of the rat. So he was depleted of dopamine, which as we know, makes things much harder to do when you don't have any dopamine. So he sat there and he would eat the stale food, even though all he had to do was like jump like a centimeter up to go get the other food. He had no drive or motivation to do it because they lowered his dopamine levels, so he just ate the stale food, which was really bad. Moving on from the rats, last point I want to make in this section is when we keep our dopamine reserves high, doing something like laundry, like a small task or a chore, will actually generate dopamine at the end of doing that task if we have some in the system. If we have a really low level and we do laundry, we don't want to do it. It's gonna be miserable the whole time. But you might be able to enjoy experiences more if you have a high level of dopamine in your system. So again, starting your day right by preserving your dopamine reserves. Try to avoid checking your phone or engaging in super high dopamine activities for the first hour of waking. It's gonna set you up for better motivation throughout your day. Moving on to point 2, strategic novelty. We talked about novelty before and we are bringing it back. The part of the brain that novelty comes into is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the memory circuit in the brain. That's where anything related to memory happens, and that's where novelty kind of hangs out. And it has a really strong influence on the nucleus accumbens, the hippocampus. So the hippocampus values novelty. Again, like I said earlier, that's why video games are addicting. That's why video games put levels in it, because it's the same thing but different. TikTok, not knowing what's next, app updates. But we can use this to our advantage in reverse. So it can actually help trigger a stronger motivational impulse when we're doing something that's similar but a little bit different. So I'm going to use exercise as an example here. So there may be a part of you that you think about exercising, or you think about a certain type of exercise and you're like, yeah, okay, tried that before and I hate it. You can actually add novelty to the mix here. So trying something different, like taking a class, yoga, Pilates. Maybe you work out by yourself. Try working out with a friend. It's the same thing but different. Maybe you work out at the gym. Try to do it at home on a YouTube video, the same type of workout, or vice versa. Bring the YouTube video to a gym. Adding a little bit of novelty will increase motivation, and it's going to trigger a positive dopamine response. So you're basically leveraging your brain's response to novelty. So when you're feeling stuck, try adding new elements to your routine. Again, like I said, with exercise. But you can also try, maybe if it's hard for you to reach a goal, add a little twist to the goal, modify your goal a little bit. Newer goal you have, like the more motivation that you're going to have as well. And I do this with my gym clients. Whenever I do personal training clients, like if we have a goal and they've achieved it so it doesn't get boring, I'll try to just sprig it a little bit, switch it up just a little bit, maybe change the grip they have on an exercise. If they can do pull-ups in a certain grip, our next goal will change it to do pull-ups with like a reverse underarm grip, something like that, where they're still motivated, it's familiar to them, but there's an added challenge that they have not accomplished yet that their brain is like really driven to do. Number 3, we're going to talk again about the balance of pain and pleasure. So we talked about how our body likes to be in that homeostasis part. So pain and pleasure lives in the VTA area in the brain. And that's also where the opioid circuit lives. It's called that. It doesn't really have to do with opioids, but that's just like the circuit that kind of lives in that part of the brain, which is associated with pleasure. So just remember, the whole brain works as a circuit. And the opioid receptors are powerful influences over the dopamine system as well. And pain correlates with pleasure. Now that we got that laid out, we can remember that when we increase pain with an activity, the pleasure will increase because we're always balancing it out. If pain goes up a little bit, that means our pleasure afterwards will be really good. Again, just think about this on like a smaller scale, not like a massive painful scale. And we're going to use working out again as an example. So think about like if we half-ass a workout, we avoid the pain, we don't actually do it, we don't really feel great afterwards, and we kind of have less reinforcement, we don't feel great afterwards, so we don't associate it with like, oh man, I felt great after that workout. But if we're doing something like we're doing 10 reps of an exercise, right? And the last 2 are super hard and you push through it and you're able to get through that really shaky shoulder press at the end, you're going to feel a rush of dopamine afterward. You're going to feel great because you put yourself through a little bit of pain, you feel great. Just in general, when you do a workout, you tend to feel really good afterwards. We tend to like avoid pain when we're stuck in addictions or in a negative dopamine cycle. So adding pain into the mix basically influences our dopamine circuitry in the brain, if you want to use that big word again. It makes a good impact on your brain is what we could say. So again, add pain, but not as much pain, not too much pain that you're not going to enjoy it at all. Like there's not going to be that good of a reward. When we press on the pain side of our brain, again, by doing something like exercise or even cold plunging. Cold plunging is like a great example of it. You feel so great afterwards. Or acupuncture, which is a little bit of pain. The body responds by basically flooding the pleasure side of the brain with tons of dopamine. And that's why it's super rewarding. Or like physically moving your body or any way that can result in dopamine. It helps bring the body back into homeostasis. And again, that's a really big goal for the body, and it always wants to be in homeostasis. So it's going to feel real good afterwards. And another fun fact about exercise is during exercise, dopamine begins to rise during the latter part of exercise. So let's say you work out for an hour, dopamine might kick in during like minute 40, and it stays elevated right after the workout for like several hours before it starts to go back down. And exercise is one of those weird things where it doesn't bring us into a dopamine deficit. Just because there's a lot of pleasure, it doesn't mean that it's actually going to make us drop again, because it has hard work involved in it, which is what we are evolved to do. Remember in the beginning I was saying we were like conditioned and trained through life to search out for water, like do the hard work of finding water or do the hard work of finding a mate, and then we get pleasure. Exercise follows that pathway, so it works with our brain, basically. It doesn't bring us into a deficit in any way. Just remember that basically the right amount of positive stress can actually enhance your dopamine system. Next up, we're going to look at the prefrontal cortex, and point number 4 is creating a dopamine-friendly environment. So the prefrontal cortex is the front part of the brain that has to do a lot with willpower and logic. We're going to look at a little bit of behavioral science, and these are some hacks I actually use at my own personal training clients. Anticipating desire before we're actually in the throes of desire, or anticipating things that may pop up before they actually pop up. So here's an activity you could do. You can, on a piece of paper or in your journal after this episode, run through the list of triggers that may make you want to dive into the habit that you're trying to break. So for me, I'm going to use the example of scrolling on my phone. And certain things may make me want to scroll on my phone. So if I'm avoiding a project, so procrastination, I'll usually scroll on my phone. If I get off a really stressful phone call to decompress, I'll find myself scrolling for a little bit. After work, if I'm tired, I'll scroll. So there's actually an acronym that they use in Alcohol Anonymous. It's called HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. And basically those are 4 emotions that somebody may be more vulnerable or prone to reaching for a bottle when they're in those emotions, because they kind of want to self-soothe. And you may be wanting to self-soothe with whatever activity you tend to do when you're just feeling depleted. Like we talked about earlier, when your dopamine is low, or when you're just feeling low and you want to have a quick boost, you may be feeling low in one of these emotions: hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. So for me, tired definitely makes me want to scroll or just do something distract, so that's a good way, is going through the triggers in your day that may make you want to do the habit, just having the awareness of it, because sometimes we're just so caught up in it, we're not aware. Then we want to make a plan B or create a barrier. I'm going to break down what both of those things mean. So, for example, again, when I have clients, I always have them come up with, we always work on 1 to 3 goals at a time, no more than that, because it's really unsustainable, right? So with those individual goals, we always come up with a plan B, because life happens. And a goal can be, I'm going to go to the gym 4 days a week, and that's something that they're going to report back to me on, right? And life happens. They may not be able to get to the gym that day because they had to stay late at work, or their kid had something after school, whatever comes up, right? But having a plan B in your head and basically planning for disaster before it happens, and knowing okay, I can't get to the gym, but you know what? I'm just going to walk around the block a few times and get some steps in, It makes you feel better, and it kind of keeps that motivation going in a sense. It's the same concept, but a little bit different here. Knowing that you have an emotion that comes up. When I'm tired, I tend to reach for my phone. Think about what your plan B can be. Instead of reaching for your phone, what could it be? Taking it into an example like that. Or creating a barrier, whether it's a literal or a metacognitive, a thought barrier between your drug of choice and you. So if you're on your phone all the time, for me, a barrier could be putting my phone outside of the room, so that when I come home, I can't get into my phone. People buy those lock boxes, same concept, putting my phone in the lockbox. Probably should get one, don't have one of those. Putting your phone in the lockbox so that you don't go on it. Or when you go to sleep, put it outside of your room and use a real alarm clock, so when you wake up in your morning, the first thing that you do isn't scroll on your phone. You have to physically turn off your alarm clock, and then you reach for your book instead of the actual phone. It's almost like out of sight, out of mind. And these are cues. We're interrupting different cues in the habit loop. And if you want to learn more about habits, I do have habit episodes in the podcast, but the book Atomic Habits by James Clear is a really good book that breaks down this whole section that we're talking about a lot better. So again, to sum it up, set up your space to better support your dopamine regulation, keep distracting devices away from you, creating physical barriers, and going through your list and having a plan B or an action plan, and just understanding what triggers you to do this thing. Okay, next up, I swear I say this every episode, but you have to hear me out. I always find a way to sneak meditation in as a solution, but you have to hear this out. I promise you, there's a lot supporting this. Number 5 is mindful anticipation, practicing mindful anticipation. So meditation and mindfulness and all those types of practices, they affect multiple parts of the brain: the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex. I'm trying to remember the names. I think I murdered the last 2 pronunciations, and the insular cortex. I think those are the parts, but there's at least 4 parts of the brain that meditation heavily affects. And Think about it, okay? Like I've been saying, we organize our life around rewards because we can easily get it so easily, and that's also how we're kind of hardwired. But when we're constantly just thinking about the reward or what's next, the future, our next hit, we're missing out on the process, which again is what our brains are designed to do, the process of having a little bit of struggle and then a reward. When we just constantly project our thoughts and psyche to the future, like towards the world that we're not in at the moment, we're not present. And that can also cause a lot of issues in so many ways. But when we learn that we can be here and be uncomfortable with it, because sometimes it may be more uncomfortable to be here in the present moment, just being okay with it here now, it's easier for us to like daydream or scroll or distract, right? But being okay with being here and not being able to control maybe the pleasure you're experiencing or the pain or anything like that, or just kind of being open to whatever comes, being in the present, just observing what comes and being okay with not controlling it. That's what meditation teaches us to do, how to observe the present and not change it. And the more that you practice meditation, even if it's 2, 5, 10 minutes a day, the more it integrates. And the goal, again, isn't to run away from whatever is happening, but to be okay, like fine with embracing the discomfort, because we just constantly want to run away from pain and discomfort. We've lost the ability to even handle minor forms of discomfort, and maybe a little bit of meditation training is that for you. So instead of seeking like instant gratification, learn to enjoy like the anticipation phase. Like slow down, let things integrate, take your time, set mindful goals, meaningful goals, and just allow yourself to look forward to rewards, but also like enjoy where you are right now, where your feet are. And I think mindfulness practices and meditation really do help when it comes to the entire dopamine cycle. We are on to our last 2 points of the episode. This next section is about emotional processing, and we're targeting our amygdala and the limbic system, which is the lower part of the brain. And we've talked about this before in our fight or flight section, so that's the part of the brain that we're going to target to kind of override the dopamine circuit. Regular emotional processing through different activities like journaling, therapy, meditation, they can help reduce your vulnerability to dopamine-seeking behaviors. So what that means is if we have a lot of negative emotions, if we're feeling anxious or down, we're drawn to want dopamine because, again, dopamine basically shuts down negative emotion, gives us a hit, and we feel good. So negative emotions, they induce the craving for dopamine. If you have a lot of negative pent-up emotions, you might be very vulnerable to wanting dopamine quick fixes, and that might even be subconscious, When we do therapy or we do inner work or we take time to meditate, journal, gratitude practices, taking walks outside, like long walks to process things, going to the gym, when we're feeling like a little bit down, we're going to the gym to like physically move through it, taking a bath, going in a sauna, you'll be amazed that these practices can actually help you become way more resistant to dopaminergic activities and wanting that quick fix, Again, I'm not just trying to sit here and be like, these things are good for you, so do them. It's not really about that, doing them just because they're good for you. If you want to understand the circuitry of your brain, you need to understand that having more of these heavy emotions and carrying it with us through everyday life, it's going to make you more addicted to the dopaminergic stuff, like period. There's a really big correlation in studies that show that when we tend to have more negative emotions, we're more drawn to these things. So working on yourself and the self-work will, in result, help this whole dopaminergic system. And the last tip I got from the book Dopamine Nation. So this tip came from that book, which is a really good book. I'm going to quote some sources and things to read and all that jazz in the episode description if you're interested. But this is a technique that came from that book, but I think it's really good and I want to share it. So we're hopping back to our prefrontal cortex, so our frontal lobe. And again, the frontal lobe is associated with willpower. When you think about doing an action, no matter what action that is, your brain has some idea of the value of that action, which is like aka what that action is worth, So let's take an example of studying and scrolling. You have a test you want to study for, and you find that sometimes you end up scrolling on your phone instead of studying. So currently, even if you can step back and kind of be like, well, obviously studying is more important than scrolling. Currently, your subconscious thinks that there is some sort of value generated by scrolling on your phone. It doesn't matter. It's already in your subconscious. If you find yourself doing it over an activity you're supposed to do, your brain is finding value there in some form or way. Your subconscious thinks that it's better to scroll right now for some reason, the hit of dopamine, than studying. And procrastination comes from here too. So let's say you have a test coming up in like 4 days, okay? And you find yourself usually studying the night before the test. Subconsciously, again, it's because your prefrontal cortex is saying, oh, day 1, I don't need to study. We're good. We can chill. We can watch a movie. Day 2, oh, you know what? I have an hour, but like I'd rather scroll. But you still have 2 days left, Then on day 3, the consequences become so big that now you get stressed out and you're like, oh my gosh, I literally have to study. I'm running out of time. I have no more time. I have to study. I have to cram. I have to get it all in now. When you could have planned it better, obviously, and studied a little bit over 3 days, but your prefrontal cortex was saying, nah, I'd rather the dopamine hit from scrolling than plan it out. And this happens actually as well with health. When people don't take their health seriously until they get really sick or they get a diagnosis or they get a pre-diagnosis, and then they start scrambling to buy like supplements, they get a gym membership because the doctor told them to. And it's a culture we live in we're not very preventative. We kind of wait till things get to the point where consequences are looming and then we take action. So it is a prominent thing. As you can see, our wiring does support it, unfortunately, because of the way that we're supposed to be living and the world we live in now. So this technique from the book Dopamine Nation is called play the tape through the end. For this exercise, you actually want to do it. You don't want to just do it in your head. It works better with writing it out, not even typing it, but if you can find a pen and a paper to do this, you are going to assess basically the two values that you're pitting against each other. And in the example I've been using, it's studying versus scrolling. So what you're going to do is you're going to write down your whole day. Like if you wanted to write down each hour of the day, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 a.m., 1 p.m., 2 p.m., like that. You're just going to write them all down. And let's say what you want to do, your dream ideal day, is you have work, but from 12 to 1, you have a break. And in that break, you want to study. Because realistically, that's going to help you out, and you'll be able to get the things you need to get done later in the day if you just study a little bit during your lunch break. But you find it really hard, and you end up scrolling during your lunch break most of the time. So to consciously assess these two things, write out your day where you have one example where you study and the other example where you scroll. Now, jump down to 5 p.m. and notice how you're going to feel. You're going to look at 5 p.m. and be like, well, at 5 p.m. on the day that I actually study, I'll feel good. I'll feel like I got things done and it'll make life easier for me and I'll just be sitting in a lot more positivity. But on the end of the day, the other example, when I scrolled instead of studying and you zoom down to 5 p.m. on that day, you're going to feel a lot shittier, at the end of the day. You're not going to feel too good because you're going to be stressed knowing that you have to study or cram or your test is at 8 a.m. and you don't have a lot of time to study because of whatever. Now, I know that you could easily sit there and do that while we're talking right now and be like, yeah, okay, well, obviously I'm going to feel better. But physically writing it out, it kind of helps it become less mindless. You can actually see your consequences written out before it happens. So it's almost like walking through a dream day in the life and then like a nightmare day in the life and seeing what would happen on day example A and B. And it becomes less mindless, like I said, because you start to see it. You put it down on paper and you don't have to actually follow through on that. You can do the example and then still scroll, but you're going to feel a bit more guilt, which in this case might be a good motivator when you're feeling that little bit of guilt. Over time, when you do this constantly, when you go back and forth between things and practice this, it kind of helps you change your inner values. So again, that's just a really good example. I've done it before and it has brought things to light. And there is something about writing it out that just makes it a lot more tangible and feels real. Those are my tips. If you noticed, I had 7 instead of 8 because halfway through I decided to scrap one of them. So we just stopped at 7. No worries. I think they were all still pretty good. Remember, the goal isn't to eliminate dopamine or any pleasure from your life. It's basically to work with your brain's natural systems to create some sort of like sustainable motivation and satisfaction with these tips. And by understanding and respecting how dopamine works, because again, it's just ingrained in us, you can build habits that support your long-term goals while still enjoying, life's pleasures along the way. You can kind of gamify all of this and make it fun. That is it for me, I think. So thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you found this information helpful, please share it with others who might benefit. Send it to a friend. Don't forget to subscribe. You can always send me a message or share the episode on Instagram. And my username is @HappyHolisticHippie. Over on Instagram, I'm also doing a giveaway. So if you want to win a $50 gift card to Amazon to celebrate 50 episodes of the Happy Hippie podcast, we have one more week left of that giveaway. And guys, not a lot of people have entered. I don't want to feel bad about it, but I'm if you enter, you have a really good chance of winning because not a lot of people have entered and there's a week left. So I'll still be running it when next week's episode is up. Maybe I'll extend it a few days if more people want to enter, but it's a $50 Amazon gift card, and all you have to do is like the post, make sure you're following the account, and then just share any episode of the Happy Hippie podcast on your story. Make sure you tag me, because maybe people are sharing it and I haven't seen it because there hasn't been a tag, but just make sure you tag me so I can see it and count your entry. You can share this episode on your story, and then you get an entry. Just share the episode and tag me, and I'm gonna give you an entry, okay? At this point, just share the episode because I have this gift card and I want to give it out to somebody who listens to the show as a big thank you. So yeah, share the episode, check out the giveaway, and I will see you next week for a nutrition themed episode.